Hi, I'm Dylan Fair, and this is my HUD project proposal for VR Ping Pong Tournament Deluxe. My Fate game is a VR arcade-style sports game involving ping pong battles against a colorful cast of characters, inspired by games like Mike Tyson's Punch-Out and Knockout League. The player pings their way through opponents in their league and must Pong the champion of the league before moving on to the next league. Each opponent has special moves, reflected by their personality through their playstyle. Each special move is forecasted by an opponent's tell, and below you can see the specs of how I'm going to be building this project. So, here's the basic game mode. Players select an opponent by pointing at them, and the player can pick opponents in any order. Pointing at an opponent will begin a match, and these matches are ping pong matches but with punch-out style tells and special attacks. The player must score at least 11 points with a 2-point lead to win a round. Winning 3 out of 5 rounds defeats an opponent. You progress through the league by defeating the 2 regular opponents and a league champion. Once you defeat the league champion, the player progresses to the next league. So, let's go over some market research. The first game I researched was Knockout League, which is an arcade-style boxing game for virtual reality. It's heavily inspired by Mike Tyson's Punch-Out and has exactly the vibe I'd like to go for, over-the-top cartoony sportsing. I think this is super interesting to me because I think it's a good example of a well-made VR game that brings a classic game into the VR space. I think this is an awesome direction for VR to go in, and it's something I want to explore. Some of the things I like about it, and want to emulate, are diegetic elements, which I think are so good for VR games, and just very fun in general, like a diegetic timer where an actual boxing ring timer would be. I also like that they display stats after a fight. I think it's cool to kind of see how your fight against that opponent went. And overall, I love the style and the feedback that the player gets. The things I don't like, however, is very basic navigation. It's a very basic 2D canvas that you point a laser pointer out and you pull the trigger to navigate. It's basic and it gets the job done. There are some unclear elements, like the one on the left. I watched a few minutes of gameplay and I'm still not sure what it's for. And some of the HUD elements get lost behind all the other flashy art, like the round timer on the right. Although I love how diegetic it is, it's kind of muted by all the other flashy, cartoony, over-the-top stuff around it. My next piece of market research is Kinectimals, which is a game for the Kinect, where players are not expected to use controllers to play the game. To account for this, HUD elements can be interacted with by hovering your hand over them for a brief time, which I think is a good way to have modals on screen without the player needing to remember where the buttons are on their controllers, which is especially great because players are going to have a big blocks blocking their vision. I also like the way larger HUD elements sway with the camera movement, which could greatly help offset the immersion breaking nature of larger blocky UI elements. I also think it would probably help a lot with motion sickness. So some of the things I like are these hover buttons, the HUD elements being affected by physics, and I think Kinectimals had pretty clear, easy to understand iconography. What I don't like, however, are that the buttons are mainly navigation focused, which isn't really an issue with the game, but it is an issue for this project, since we're specifically turning away from menu navigation and focusing on in-game HUDs. I also don't like the trail effect of the hand movement. While that might be fine for the Kinect, I think it could be very disorienting and overwhelming in a VR game. Also, how much the game pays attention to the player's pose. Again, I think a really good thing in Kinect, but in VR we have actual buttons you can push, squeeze, and triggers you can pull, so I don't think it's really necessary. My final piece of market research is Skyrim VR. Everybody loves Skyrim, but I think the VR version serves more as an example of what not to do with my project. So what I like is that the inventory is in relation to hand location. So in Skyrim, you know you have a sword by looking down in your hand and seeing a sword. In my game, the player would look down to see they have a paddle. They can also look at the Sweatband to see their stats instead of a full inventory. There's also very few HUD elements, which means less screen clutter, which also means a more immersive experience, which is great for VR. And to be honest, I couldn't find a third thing that I liked, so they make some good money. What I don't like, however, is that the normal HUD elements for a normal game don't just transfer directly into a VR space. So just having a big old block with a bunch of text is very boring, it can be very hard to navigate, and it's very immersion breaking. There's also some pointless HUD elements, like why is there a health bar where your belt buckle would be? So here's an overview of my HUD. The HUD for my game will have two states, between matches and during matches. Between matches, the player wields a paddle in their right hand. Flipping the paddle reveals silhouettes of the opponents in the current league, and whether or not they've been defeated. The player can also look at their wrists to see their current win-loss ratio, which ideally would become more tattered with more losses. Opponents appear on screens next to their stats. Holding your paddle over the challenge button will lead to the opponent jumping out of the screen, ready for that ping pong match. And during these matches, the player can glance at their wristband, but now to see the current score of the match, which is replicated by the large monitor behind their opponent. During gameplay, if the opponent has a tell, a slightly opaque outline of a paddle will appear where the player needs to hit the ball to counter that special move. At all times, a HUD element will be visible in the top corner, on the same side the paddle is being held. Hovering over this will pause the game, activating the pause modal. So here's a basic wireframe of these two states. On the left, we have between matches. You can see the opponent screen in front of you, which displays the name, defeated and challenged stats, which is how many times the player has defeated them versus how many times they've challenged them. You also see a list of tells that have been unlocked. There's also that large challenge button that can be hovered over, and to the left of all of this is an image of that opponent. There's also the paddle on the bottom right and the sweatband on the bottom left. Now on the right side, we have the HUD wireframe during a match. The opponent screen shifts to the left and changes into a scoreboard. The player's wristband also switches to another scoreboard. The silhouettes on the paddle also disappear, and this is done to help reduce the amount of distractions that players have during an actual match. In both of these states, the pause paddle in the top right can still be visible and activated. So, for my color palette. My first project had a lot of issues with color choice, and one of the best things that came from that project is TA Ramona helping me find Coblis, which is the color blindness simulator. I also discovered that I spent a long time trying to find a color palette that worked, when that could have been time that I spent using a good color palette. So this time instead, I went to a site called Color Hex, and I found this retro arcade color palette by JJ Monster, and I ran it through Coblis, and I like it. I like it through all the filters available. And using these filters, I found that the first and third color, yellow and blue, were the best contrasting colors. So I plan to use those for elements that will contain text. The other colors can help create an 80s arcade vibe by highlighting the other elements. So, my HUD elements. The first one is the win-loss counter, which is on the sweatband. The player can check their sweatband to see how many wins and how many losses they have. The transforms of this canvas component will be directly connected to the controller movement and rotation. The signal for this is the player looking at their sweatband, which causes the text to quickly fade in, accompanied by a sound effect. This updates when the player looks at the sweatband after winning or losing a match. This causes the text to fade out the old values with a sound effect. This resolves with the second half of that sound effect being played while the new values fade in. And that'll look like this. My second element is the paddle progress tracker. On the face of the player's paddle, progress throughout the current league can be seen. All opponents, including the champion, can be seen on the paddle, and red X's get drawn across defeated opponents. The signal of this is a player rotating their paddle, which causes images of the league's opponents to fade in, followed by red X's over defeated opponents. This is updated the next time the player looks at their paddle after defeating an opponent. This causes a red X to get drawn over that opponent one line at a time, along with a sound effect. This resolves by the player avatar sighing a sigh of relief, and that'll look and sound a little like this. Our third element is the opponent screen. Opponents in the league appear on screens, which display their avatar, name, and tells, which are hints for defeating them. There's also a button that can initiate the match. Tells can be discovered by encountering their special moves in a match. Once a challenge button is clicked on, the opponent jumps out of the screen as the screen goes away and returns as a scoreboard, the fourth element, which we'll cover next. So, the opponent screens hover idly, playing a sound effect. After a match, and if the player encounters an opponent's special move, the tell is revealed. This updates by the newly revealed tell information replacing the question mark text on the opponent screen, while a sound effect plays, and the text quickly fades in. This resolves by the new tell information appearing as yellow text with a blue outline until another match is played. This will signify to players that there is new information available that they should read before starting a new match. And that'll look like this. The fourth element is the scoreboard itself. Whenever anybody scores a point, the scoreboard should update with a new score. I want to limit the animation on this because I think that could be very distracting during a match, and it's also something that happens very frequently. So to counter this lack of animation, I'd like to use extra sound effects. And when the match is over, the scoreboard flies off screen and turns into the opponent's screen. I'd also like to eventually add particle effects to the scoreboard when the player scores a point. So the basic signal update and resolve of this is a player scores a point, sound effects plays, and the scoreboard now has the new information. But when the player scores a point, the number on the scoreboard changes paired with the regular sound effects, and I'd like to add particle effects for player points. I'd also like this to resolve. I'd also like player points to resolve with an unknown announcer saying tubular, which should sound like this.
Tubular!
The final element is the pause paddle. This is persistent during all states of gameplay. It's a slightly opaque paddle that can be hovered over. Hovering a paddle over this button increases its opacity and plays a sound effect for a short time before pausing the game and opening the pause menu. If the player stops hovering over this element, the pause action is cancelled. So, this signal is a player's paddle being hovered over the pause paddle element. While it's being hovered over, this pause paddle element will turn yellow, and its opacity increases over time while a build-up sound effects plays. This should resolve once the pause paddle has been hovered over for X amount of seconds. This will pause the game and pop up the pause modal, along with a sound effect. The X amount of seconds is one of the first things I'd like to playtest. I'd like to playtest how long is too long for holding down the pause button to pause. It's also dangerous because I don't want it to be too short that players consistently accidentally pause the game. And this is what that should sound like. And again, my name is Dylan Fair, and this is VR Ping Pong Tournament Deluxe. Thank you.